of friendly autocrats around the world severely eroded US credibility on human rights. So the occasional US condemnation of human rights in places like Venezuela or Cuba or Iran rang hollow when parallel praise was bestowed on the likes of Russia, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, or Israel, excuse me. After 4 years of Trump's indifference and often hostility to human rights, the election of Joe Biden provides an opportunity for a fundamental change. But it's important to recognize that a Biden presidency alone is not a panacea. In recent decades, with each new US president, there has been wild shifts in US human rights policy. And frankly, pro-human rights leaders around the world are understandably asking, can we rely on the United States? And it's a fair question. Fortunately, many governments treated Washington's unreliability as cause for resolve rather than despair. And so what we've seen over the last 4 years is that many of these governments recognized that human rights were too important to abandon just because Trump did. So even as China and Russia and their allies sought to undermine the global human rights system, a series of coalitions of governments came to its defense. So for example, in Latin America, a group of democracies plus Canada, known as the Lima Group, spearheaded the defense of human rights in Venezuela. The Organization of Islamic Cooperation, currently 56 mostly Muslim majority nations, played a central role in defending the rights of Rohingya Muslims facing persecution in Myanmar. A broad range of governments in Europe and beyond condemned China and Saudi Arabia for their repression. The European Union pressured Hungary and Poland to reverse autocratic trends there and pressured Belarus to allow a fair election. Germany, France, and Turkey combined to force Russia and Syria to stop bombing civilians in Syria's Idlib province, where 3 million civilians were at risk. And a broad range of governments even stood up to Trump's unconscionable attack on the rule of law when he imposed sanctions on the International Criminal Court prosecutor, simply because she had the audacity to be interested in investigating US torture in Afghanistan and Israeli war crimes in Palestine. Now, this growing number of governments involved in the defense of human rights arguably made it more robust, even without the United States. So as Biden takes office, he should seek to strengthen, not to supplant, these broader collective efforts in defense of human rights. Now, when it comes to China, an expanding coalition of governments overcame their traditional fear of economic retaliation to find their voices to criticize China's mounting repression, arguably the worst that has been since the murderous crackdown on the Tiananmen Square pro-democracy movement in 1989. So most recently, in October, at the UN General Assembly, a German-led initiative brought a record 40 countries together to condemn Beijing's repression of Uyghur and other Turkic Muslims in Xinjiang. Now, as typically happens, China organized a counterstatement. They do this after every condemnation. And they reach out to the usual dictators and thugs to praise their repression. But even those numbers are falling. Just from 2019 to 2020, the number of governments willing to applaud the repression fell from 54 to 45, nearing a parity with those willing to condemn, suggesting for the first time, looking forward, that we may soon be able to formally condemn Chinese repression at the United Nations, something that so far has not been possible. Interestingly, if you look at the Muslim majority countries, there always are disappointing exceptions, the governments like Pakistan or Saudi Arabia that can't help themselves but praise China. But a growing number of governments want nothing to do with Beijing's repression of their fellow Muslims in Xinjiang. And so, for example, from 2019 to 2020, the number of governments willing to join with China fell from 25 to 19, with a large majority, 37, abstaining altogether, just wanting nothing to do with this effort. Now, evidence of this mounting global disapproval of China's conduct could also be seen when China ran for a seat on the United Nations Human Rights Council. 4 years ago, when it ran, China received the most votes of any candidate from the Asia Pacific region. This year, it received the fewest number of votes from that region, with the exception of Saudi Arabia, which was denied a seat, a good thing. So these are important trends, which frankly, the Chinese government clearly notices because it cares about its global reputation. It seeks to enhance its global legitimacy and to frankly fend off global criticism of its repression. So this mounting willingness to condemn China's repression, in our view, is the best way to mitigate its brutal crackdown. Biden can contribute to this trend by abandoning Trump's inconsistent, transactional, unilateral approach to China, an approach that frankly discouraged other governments from joining him. Instead, Biden should adopt a much more principled, consistent, and multilateral approach to join with rather than try to act on his own in addressing China's brutality. Now, more fundamentally, Biden's challenge is not simply to reverse Trump's damage to the human rights cause, important as that is, but he also has to try to change the narrative on human rights in a more fundamental way so that it can better survive future changes of administration. Perhaps ironically, Biden has to start his presidency by thinking about the end of his presidency to ensure that the next president does not reverse everything that he has done in the realm of human rights. Now, given the slight majority that the Democrats are going to enjoy at the outset in the two houses of Congress, some of this can be done by legislation, and that's certainly to be encouraged. Ideally, the US would ratify major human rights treaties that it has long neglected, but that requires 2/3 of the Senate, which is probably going to be difficult to secure. But one thing that Biden can clearly do is to allow justice to pursue its course with respect to Trump, to show that no one is above the law, or as Biden recently put it, that the president of the United States is not a king. Biden should not make the same mistake as President Obama when he was confronting the torture that had been committed under the Bush administration. You all recall that Obama said, we're going to look forward, not back, as his excuse for not allowing criminal prosecutions and allowing a precedent of impunity for torture to stand that only encourages more outrages, suggesting that the president, in that case Bush or his vice president Cheney, were somehow above the law. Now, what Biden should do is to let professional prosecutors assess the evidence without interference. The president shouldn't order prosecution. He should just let the professionals do what they do, to examine the evidence and to prosecute any crimes they find that Trump or his enablers have committed. And certainly that would include looking at Trump's encouragement of a mob, including many white supremacists, to attack the Capitol just last week, as well as his recent call to Georgia election officials asking them to find 11,000 more votes. Now, I'm aware that some people have argued that prosecuting Trump would be too divisive, that this is a difficult moment, that there's a need to heal. But it's also important to uphold the rule of law, especially with respect to the president. And what I would hope is that most people in the United States can find reconciliation around reasserting the rule of law as it applies to every government official, including at the top. Now, ultimately, Biden's goal has to be to reshape public appreciation of human rights, to make it harder for future administrations to resume Trump's ways. For inspiration, Biden could look to past US President Jimmy Carter, who introduced human rights as an element of US foreign policy. At that time, it was a radical move, but it struck a chord with the American people and has endured. Not everybody followed it to the T, but no one was willing to repudiate it. For Biden to reshape public understanding in a similar way, he's going to begin at home to speak about issues more regularly in terms of human rights, especially in the area of economic and social rights, which traditionally the US government has been reluctant to embrace. One silver lining in the pandemic is that it provides an opportunity to talk in this broader way about human rights, because more Americans have come to understand the importance of economic and social rights. So, for example, as Biden seeks to bolster access to healthcare, as he said he would do, he should speak in the terms of the right of everyone to see a doctor without bankrupting their family. As he pushes for unemployment assistance, he's also trying to do that. He should reaffirm the right of everyone to put food on their table, even if they lose their job. More regular invocation of rights in these basic ways will help to shift public perception of the fundamental values that are at stake, thus making it harder for the next president to back off, to resume the old ways. Now, to instill more consistency in US foreign policy, Biden should affirm that promoting human rights is not just an element of US foreign policy, but a guiding principle. That doesn't mean it always wins, but that is a very important factor. And he should then abide by that principle, even when it's politically difficult. That means transcending the double standards that so often have infected US human rights policy in the past. So, for example, Biden should insist that the US is not going to provide military aid or sell arms to systematically abusive governments. He then should apply that principle even to friendly governments by stopping military aid or arms sales to the likes of Saudi Arabia, Egypt, the United Arab Emirates, or Israel. He should be more outspoken about governments that commit serious violations of human rights, even if they're friendly. That would mean, for example, criticizing the government of Indian Prime Minister Modi for encouraging discrimination and violence against Muslims, even though India is going to be important in the contest with China. He should re-embrace the UN Human Rights Council, reversing Trump's decision to pull back, even though the council criticizes Israeli abuses. He should void Trump's awful sanctions on the International Criminal Court prosecutor, even if her investigations are pointing toward US torture or Israeli war crimes. To sum it up, turning the clock back 4 years is not going to be enough to undo Trump's damage. The world has changed, and so must the defense of human rights. Now that many nations have responded to Trump by assuming leadership roles themselves, Biden should seek to join that enhanced defense of human rights, not to supplant it. Meanwhile, Biden needs to recognize that Trump magnified traditional policy shifts between US administrations into a crisis of credibility on human rights. So Biden should seek to reframe public appreciation of human rights so that the US commitment becomes entrenched in a way that his successors cannot so easily reverse. That also will make it harder for some future president to resume Trump's attacks on US democracy. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks, Ken, for that illuminating introduction. Now we will take written questions. So as a reminder, please post using the Q&A functions. I'm going to start with a question from Twitter, which is, Ken, to pick up on something that you were just saying, with regards to the abuses unfolding in Xinjiang, China, what can the world actually do to stop this happening?
Well, I mean, as I said, Beijing is very sensitive to global opinion. You know, it cares about its legitimacy. It wants to suppress criticism. And so what we found is that there is, already a reaction to the mounting criticism in Xinjiang. There have been various show tours that the government has allowed in response to this pressure. It actually gave a number with respect to the people affected by its practices, 1.3 million, a large number similar to the ones used by human rights groups. It didn't say they were in detention, it said they were in vocational training centers, but nonetheless, it had to respond. And notably, it then said many of them were graduating, which is, I guess, it's euphemism for being released. Now, the new problem is that many of them seem to be released into forced labor. This is a step sideways, not a step forward. But it shows that Beijing is very attentive to global criticism. And I think that if this criticism continues to mount, if Biden can work with others, if France and Germany continue to play a leadership role in these areas, France has more to do, frankly. This could make a big difference in building those numbers And that, I think, is the most likely way to affect the leadership in Beijing to ease up on their awful, intense repression of Uyghur and other Turkic Muslims in Xinjiang.
Thanks. Can we have a question from Radio Azodi, the Tajik service of Radio Free Europe? I don't know if you want to take this or whether we should go directly to Hugh Williamson on this one. The question is, in recent years, the West, the European Union, human rights organizations, and Human Rights Watch have all criticized the government of Tajikistan for suppressing human rights and political freedoms. But the Tajik government is ignoring these calls. Is it time for the Tajik government to change its attitude? Hugh, do you want to take that?
I'll take that, yeah. Hugh Williamson here, thanks so much. Yeah, I mean, it was another bad year for human rights in Tajikistan in 2020. The parliamentary elections in March were ruled not free and fair by the most important election monitoring group, the OSCE. Tajikistan was very late in recognizing the impact of the pandemic and therefore put many people's lives at risk by doing so. There was also a spread of COVID in prisons in Tajikistan, which was very worrying, which we documented as well. There was also a spike or an increase in domestic violence documented in Tajikistan during last year. So to answer one of your questions, there was a worsening of human rights conditions in the country last year. What has the country been doing about it? There were some significant steps last year. The European Union raised serious human rights concerns with Tajikistan in its annual human rights dialogue with the country. And the United Nations, an important working group of the United Nations, raised the continued jailing of opposition politicians in the country. So we would encourage further action by international partners of Tajikistan to raise human rights and put those as central elements in their relationships with Tajikistan, and link human rights concerns with their economic relationships and their security relationships. Thanks for the question.
Thank you, Hugh. Ken, there's a question here about the conflict in Ethiopia's Tigray region. What's your view on that conflict?
Well, Human Rights Watch recently had a team on the Tigrayan border looking at this. And we found very disturbing evidence. There were evidence of large-scale executions. There was evidence of indiscriminate shelling of urban areas. The difficulty that we face, quite frankly, is that because of the communications cutoff that the government has imposed on Tigray, it's very difficult to attribute responsibility. And there clearly is a need to open Tigray to allow international investigation so that attribution regarding these atrocities can be determined. There clearly is a proliferation of actors there. The government, the Tigrayan forces, allied militias on both sides, Eritrean forces have been there. So there's a real need to open it up. Frankly, there's also an urgent humanitarian need. The UN just came out last week to say that roughly half the population of Tigray needs humanitarian assistance. And it's difficult to provide that in circumstances where communication and access is so difficult. So we are deeply concerned about Tigray. We only know part of what's going on. And I think the best way to deter future atrocities is for the government to open up the.
Thanks, Ken. So I have a question from Christian Ulrich of the German press agency DPA, which is about what role should European governments play going forward with regards to Turkey?
Well, I think that European governments have allowed themselves to be blackmailed by Erdogan to some extent. In that, he in the deal that he struck with Angela Merkel, he stopped the flow of migrants from Turkey to Greece to a significant extent. He did, threaten to open that up a little bit earlier last year. But what I see is that the European Union has allowed itself to be silenced about the very disturbing crackdown that Erdogan and his AKP party has imposed on any domestic political challenge. And obviously his leading political opponent remains in prison, has been there for 5 years. Leading civil society activists like Osman Kavala are in prison. And Erdogan is doing this from a position of domestic weakness, in the sense that if you look at the recent mayoral elections in Istanbul and Ankara and Izmir, the AKP lost. But he is determined to censor the media, to try to shut down civil society, and to manipulate the electoral system to stay in power. Europe should not be silent in the face of those attacks on basic democratic principles. And yes, there is the potential of another migration crisis, but it's time for the European Union to stop allowing Erdogan to blackmail them. He is himself vulnerable politically. He has enormous economic needs, and he shouldn't be simply driving the EU to silence.
Thank you, Ken. I just want to also apologize to French speakers on the call, because apparently the French interpretation has not been working well, while the Arabic and Spanish has. So our apologies for that. Ken, I wanted to go to another question from Twitter, which is very timely. And I don't know if you might want to bring Mausi in on this as well, but what does Human Rights Watch have to say about repression in Uganda ahead of their general election tomorrow?
Yeah, I mean, we've been deeply troubled by President Museveni's, repeated use of violence by security forces to suppress campaigning, particularly by his principal electoral opponent, Bobi Wine, the musician turned politician. Clearly, Wine has struck a chord of popularity across the country, but Museveni's government has used the pretext of the pandemic to prevent many campaigning events by Bobi Wine, while of course Museveni's rallies seem to go forward. Just yesterday, I guess, or the last 24 hours, Facebook shut down a series of fake accounts that were being used to promote Museveni, and he retaliated by shutting down all of Facebook. And he seems to be using kind of every trick under the sun: repeated arrests of Bobi Wine, beatings of his supporters, in some cases shooting and killing people. It's gotten so bad that Bobi Wine campaigns with a helmet and a bulletproof vest, this in the middle of an election. So, I would have hoped that Museveni could allow a fair poll. He's been in power for 30 plus years, but he seems determined to use violence and repression to prevent a fair contest tomorrow. Mausi, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yeah, thanks, Ken. I mean, it's a deeply troubling situation in Uganda. Beyond the repression of political participants in the elections, which are actually coming up tomorrow, is the continued repression. It's just a part of a wider pattern of abuses and lack of accountability on the part of the government of Uganda. We've seen senior and well-respected activists like Nicholas Opio. He's been in detention since early December, and a number of journalists have also been picked up by authorities. The government has systematically arrested different actors across the country, blocked public political meetings, and continues to fail to ensure accountability for past and current abuses. We're hoping that the elections tomorrow would take a less violent turn, but we unfortunately, the events of the last few weeks portend a troubling situation tomorrow and perhaps the coming days.
Thanks, Mausi. Ken, we have a question for you, although feel free to bring in Ahmed if you want, on Egypt. What do you have to say about repression in Egypt, particularly the plight of the jailed activist Allah Abdel Fattah?
Well, I mean, Allah, in a sense, epitomizes the extraordinarily severe repression under now President Sisi. Repression that is, far worse than any time in modern recent history. Much worse than under Mubarak, much worse than under Morsi, which Sisi claimed was so intolerable that he had to mount a military coup. to reverse the one freely elected government that Egypt has known in ever. So, what we see is just the silencing of the Egyptian media. It now just is a mouthpiece for the government. A crackdown on civil society, including human rights groups. The Egyptian Initiative for Personal Responsibility or Personal Rights was, openly attacked a month ago. The government stepped back only because of broad international outrage. But I think Sisi gets away with this because the international community falsely views him as a guardian of stability. If you look at what happened when he visited France last month, it was an utter outrage. He was treated as he was given a kind of a formal state visit, which is complete with literally rolling out the red carpet, a military parade, and Macron bestowing Légion d'honneur on him, the highest award of France. This because why? Because he, helped stop migration from Eritrea, because he is, supposedly fighting jihadists in the northern Sinai, although his crackdown is actually pushing people in the direction of the jihadists. He's using summary executions and the like to fight that battle. But I think most fundamentally, he has declared effective war on the Muslim Brotherhood, this very much following in the footsteps of the Saudis and the Emiratis. The Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt represents electoral Islam. Their great offense was to try to elect and succeed in electing a president. Sisi is trying to deny them that possibility. He wants to pretend that political Islam is the same thing as terrorism. It's the same thing as jihadism. And that's a horrible approach because, some people will just go home and bite their lip and be mad. But that pushes some people into the hands of the jihadists who say, well, if I can't pursue an election, I may resort to violence. And sadly, the French government has kind of endorsed this approach. So I think there's a real need to reassess Sisi. This is a false stability built on repression. There had been a reasonably open civil society, even under Mubarak. I mean, it was repressive, but there were dissident voices allowed. There were civil organizations that flourished. And that has all been shut down with tens of thousands of political prisoners and systematic torture. It's time to stop looking at Sisi as a guardian of stability. He's the opposite.
Thanks, Ken. There's a question here from Philip Curl, who hasn't identified his outlet. What is Human Rights Watch's position on the decision of Twitter, Facebook, and other platforms to close President Trump's account?
I mean, frankly, with respect to Trump's account, I think the platforms did the right thing and perhaps even belatedly. By the time they finally came to shutting him down, he was using these really to openly encourage white supremacists, to foment hatred, obviously to spread lies about the big lie about his supposed electoral win, but most important to foment the mob that attacked the Capitol, complete with many white supremacists among them. And frankly, to this day is now threatening to replicate that action in state capitals across the country and in Washington on January 20th for the inauguration. So, platforms, the social media companies, like any company, they have a duty to avoid complicity in human rights violations. And this is all that they could do at this stage. They, in a sense, gave Trump plenty of warnings. He was incorrigible, he persisted, and they took the step they needed to do. Now, that said, I do still think that we should not just, accept current reality with the social media platforms. They have not been applying their so-called community standards in a consistent way. And I thought it was interesting that, just as they were shutting down Trump, a call came out in Myanmar to Facebook. Why are you letting the Myanmar army use Facebook to recruit soldiers who in turn are used to violently suppress ethnic minorities in Myanmar? It's a fair question. And we've seen that the platforms are really not investing enough, particularly in linguistic and cultural skills in various parts of the world where their platforms really often are used to incite violence and divisiveness. So I think there's a need to ensure that these standards that they're applying are applied in a more consistent, principled way. And one important way to do that is that there is not currently a real appeals process, an independent appeals process. And so you have these, billionaire CEOs like Zuckerberg making these decisions. That's not the way you get a principled approach. So I think what these platforms need to do is to set up independent panels that don't answer to the executive, to which appeals can be had. So that it's not just a senior executive that cuts somebody off, but there is an opportunity to review these decisions and to ensure that they are the product of principles fairly applied across the board.
Can I just ask you a follow-up though, Ken, to people who say many people in the States are saying this is an attack on free speech and this is silencing Donald Trump for his political affiliations. How do you think that's a fair take?
Yeah, I mean, I do. The platforms all say that they uphold free expression, and and have tried to do that. I think quite genuinely. The right to free expression is, of course, limited by criminality. If I engage in a criminal conspiracy to murder somebody, I'm using words, but that's not free expression. That's a crime. So I think the platforms are trying to draw these lines, and they may not be doing it, as best as they can. I do think there's clearly improvement to be had. One important thing that could be done is, frankly, break up the monopoly. I mean, it's worth asking, why does Facebook own Instagram? Why does Google own YouTube? I mean, there is a lack of diversity within the platforms, which is troubling. And if we had more diversity, these concerns would be lesser. It's also, quite clear that the platforms were more deferential to governmental leaders, to political leaders, because they felt that political speech was so important, which it is. But I think they failed to recognize adequately that governmental leaders also have a duty, separate from ordinary citizens, to avoid promoting divisiveness, promoting discrimination, promoting violence. And so I think, if anything, they erred too much in allowing speech that really had crossed the line some time ago. They acted belatedly, but in the end, I think they did the right thing.
Thanks. Completely different subject, although possibly connected. Can you talk to us and summarize for us what happened in Kashmir during the course of 2020? And feel free to also bring in Meenakshi Ganguly if you would like.
Well, Meenakshi is the expert on that. Let me just say a word and then pass it to her. But obviously, Prime Minister Modi's government has now been over a year since its quite brutal crackdown in Kashmir. And while most people have been released from detention, a communications shutdown continues in place. I mean, at this point, I think it's only 2G service, so everything's very, very slow. And of course, as the political crackdown was eased, the COVID crackdown started. So it has economically devastated the region. But there really has been, a lack of accountability for ongoing violence. The Armed Forces Special Services Act, I'm actually got to give the right word, but the law that basically gives security forces in places like Kashmir license to kill with impunity needs to be repealed. And the kind of actions in Kashmir that the Modi government has pursued are of a piece with the broader anti-Muslim agenda that we've seen in Assam and in many other parts of India, which clearly needs to be re-examined. And the idea that 200 million Muslims are treated as second-class citizens, or sometimes not even as citizens at all, is a profound problem for the world's largest democracy. But let me turn it to Meenakshi to elaborate.
Thank you, Ken. Yes, indeed, Kashmir, after the government revoked the constitutional autonomy in August 2019, the promise was that things are going to get better. And yet, what we find is that Kashmiris continue to be repressed. They are not allowed a voice. Journalists, activists have been raided. They've been silenced. They've been threatened. They are routinely stopped from reporting events that are happening. And when I speak with Kashmiris, a lot of them remain extremely concerned about their future, literally their future, and what's going to happen going forward. A politician recently spoke about how he was feeling completely disillusioned. And this is because, although, as you said, Ken, some of the political leaders were released from detention, after that they were running for local elections. And again, the political discourse from BJP and its leaders was often undermining that political process by suggesting that the leaders are all anti-state, This is terrible. Recently, there have been incidents and allegations of extrajudicial killings. The one that happened last year in May was one of the few occasions when the army admitted that there was an extrajudicial killing and ordered an investigation. Charges have been filed in that case, but the Armed Forces Special Powers Act prevents soldiers from being prosecuted in civilian courts. And that is why we keep saying that the Armed Forces Special Powers Act needs to be repealed. Thank you.
Thanks, Meenakshi. Ken, a question from Derek Young from Apple Daily. What do you think of the recent crackdown in Hong Kong and the national security law imposed? What can be done by the international society to stop the oppression of Hong Kong democratic legislators, as well as the people pursuing democracy and freedom?
Well, let me begin by saying that to call it the national security law is a complete misnomer. I realize that's Beijing's name, but it's really a Communist Party security law. That's what this is about. This is about shutting down criticism of Beijing and any effort to turn Hong Kong into what was promised in the one country, two systems agreement, a bastion of freedom. And so what is being attacked is really people who are acting like pro-democracy people, legislators who challenge the government as somehow a national security threat now. People who protest for the right to speak out publicly are being jailed. Most recently, people who even tried to flee the persecution heading to Taiwan are being prosecuted. So, I think what is needed is, ongoing public condemnation. This is, it's an utter outrage, and it's sad because Hong Kong was such a special city. It really did have freedom, and that has been gradually taken away. But let me turn it to Sophie Richardson, because she's deeply involved with this, and to see if she wants to say anything further.
Sure, good morning, thanks. Among the steps that we've recommended that governments take in what we've publicly characterized as a roadmap for repression, it's time for governments to impose targeted individual sanctions on the officials in Beijing and Hong Kong who are responsible for this law. The world needs to remember that international human rights law still is meant to prevail in Hong Kong. It's a party to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And there's a lot of room to provide support and safe harbor to people who are fleeing repression in the territory. And this may seem like a bit of a historical note, but if we look back at the Sino-British Joint Declaration, one of the features it lacks is any kind of a redress mechanism through which human rights issues and violations of human rights could be addressed. And as we're watching other kinds of agreements move ahead with the Chinese government, like the proposed EU-China investment agreement, those need to have not just notional promises that China might think at some point in the future about complying with ILO standards. Those agreements have to have black letter enforceable guarantees to protect human rights. I think Beijing has made it very clear it has no intention of abiding by some of its previous commitments, and to accept some unspecified, vague, future-oriented commitment, I think is a real slap in the face to all of the people in Hong Kong and Tibet and Xinjiang across China who spend their lives struggling to secure rights.
Thanks. I think you actually predicted a couple of questions that we had from Pierre Haskey about the recent investment agreement between the EU and China, and from Dahai from VOA's China branch. So I hope you feel that your questions have been answered, but both of you feel free to put a follow-up in the chat.
Maybe I could just add a word on that, Emma, because
okay.
If the European Union had been serious about avoiding complicity in the forced labor of Uyghur and other Turkic Muslims, it could have said, we're not going to sign the investment deal until this forced labor ends, until we have independent inspectors inside who can actually confirm that it has ended. That's what a serious commitment to ending forced labor would have looked like. Instead, as Sophie notes, the European Union settled, not even for ratifying the treaty violating that prohibits forced labor, but a commitment to work toward ratifying that treaty. I mean, this is the most minimalist, fig leaf that you can imagine. So it's sad that Angela Merkel seems so determined to enact, to get this investment agreement before her presidency of the European Union ended last month. and essentially gave away the store when it comes to the rights of Uyghur and other Turkic Muslims. Nothing in that agreement is stopping Beijing's growing use of Uyghur and Turkic Muslim forced labor.
Thanks both. I will say that our regional experts will be leaving in about 10 minutes to go to their follow-up Zoom calls. I think we have the capacity to put the Zoom links for those calls in this chat. I hope that's right, and we'll be able to drop that for people who want to go and have more detailed conversations on any of these issues. We will keep the main conference going till 1 and then possibly a few minutes after if necessary. Ken, I'm going to switch regions now and ask about Saudi. A question from a Twitter user. Can you summarize the situation in Saudi? Why are human rights abuses there still continuing despite all the international pressure?
Well, obviously, Saudi Arabia is very wealthy, so it can buy off certain forms of criticism, and it has a certain insulation from economic pressure. But the Saudi crown prince likes to portray himself as a reformer, but what he really means is that he will reform, according to what he wants. If you look at somebody like, the Lujan Al-Haflul, the women's rights activist who was just sentenced to 5 years and 8 months for simply demanding the right to drive, a right that the crown prince later granted. But her real offense was to demand that right rather than just wait for the crown prince to do it as a matter of royal prerogative. He does not accept any form of activism, any independent voice in Saudi Arabia. He has to be the supposedly benevolent monarch who clearly has shown himself to be not the least bit benevolent. And so, I think the pressure has to be put on the crown prince. The Biden administration has some opportunities here because, Congress already voted to cut off arms sales to Saudi Arabia because of the targeting of civilians in Yemen. Trump went forward anyway. Biden, though, has significant backing to stop this. And I think what we need is really sustained pressure from Europe, the United States, from Antonio Guterres, who has been very unwilling to criticize the Saudi government. These are, if there really is genuine commitment to pressing the crown prince to stop this repression, rather than Trump, buddying up with him because he supposedly creates US jobs, they could make a big difference.
Thanks, Ken. Since you mentioned Antonio Guterres, we do have a question from Matthew Lee from Inner City Press asking, what will a second Guterres term mean for human rights?
Well, the first term hasn't been great. Unfortunately, Guterres's view on human rights is that it suffices to make broad statements of endorsement without naming particular perpetrators. And while, I'm happy for him to say, I uphold human rights, if no one feels the heat, nobody changes. And the real test of Guterres's effectiveness is, does somebody feel the heat from his commentary on human rights? And the answer generally is no, because he doesn't name anybody. Now, he did issue this call to action on human rights, but so far it's been more call than action. He really hasn't changed. So I hope that as governments, particularly the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council, consider Guterres's candidacy for a second term, that they will press him on a more outspoken, targeted commitment to human rights. And the irony is that, Guterres's human rights record pales not only with respect to Kofi Annan, which you would perhaps expect since Annan was so well known for his support for human rights, but it pales even next to Ban Ki-moon, who, started off, somewhat timid and reluctant, but in the end was much more willing to speak out about human rights and to name perpetrators in a way that Guterres has shown himself unwilling to do. So I hope that governments press him that if he wants a second term, he's got to have a more effective way of showing his commitment to human rights.
Thanks. Now we're moving to a question from Turkmen Terzi, representing the Turkish outlet TR724. The Turkish government has been continuously jailing Gulen followers without any charge, as Erdogan blames the Gulen movement for the coup attempt. What is HRW doing to address this?
Well, we've been quite outspoken that, obviously participants in the coup attempt committed a crime and they can be prosecuted. And, undoubtedly a significant number of them were Gulenists. But there's a distinction between actually joining a criminal conspiracy versus simply being a member in a broad political or religious group. And Erdogan has completely demolished that distinction. So, he's going after not simply people who sort of belong to the Gulenist movement, but people who have, an app on their phone that Erdogan equates with somehow being, a member of this group. And it has completely transcended any proper understanding of complicity in a crime and becomes simply persecution of a movement. That's wrong. And it is, if you look back historically, it's as if, Erdogan was happy to have an alliance with Gulen when Gulen was helpful in curtailing the threat of the military to pose a coup against, at that point, a moderate Islamist government. There had been a history of coups in the past. Gulen's movement helped to put the military under civilian rule of law, particularly through the many prosecutors and judges who were in the Gulen movement. But now that Erdogan has what he wants, he's turned on Gulen and is using, the unfortunate coup attempt, the crime that was committed there, to persecute every Gulenist rather than focus narrowly on the people who are actually responsible for that crime.
We have a question here from Santiago Barnuevo from Spain's national radio. What could we expect for the situation of human rights violations in Latin America, particularly in Venezuela and Colombia? Is there any change that could be achieved with a new approach by the new US administration?
Well, with respect to Venezuela, the obvious lesson, which I alluded to in my opening remarks, is that Biden should treat Venezuela as part of a consistent U.S. human rights policy. Not simply attack Venezuela and Cuba because they were the perceived adversaries, while ignoring Bolsonaro or Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador or other more friendly abusive leaders. Second, he should recognize that the Lima Group is an unprecedented development in Latin America. That traditionally Latin American governments didn't criticize each other's human rights records because that was seen as something that Washington did. That was Yankee imperialism. That's changed now. Latin American democracies are taking responsibility for their own region, which is great. Biden should join that. He should not try to supplant it. He should recognize that the US is an important voice, but it should be part of a broad multilateral effort. And I could say something similar with respect to Cuba, where the problem with the traditional embargo is it was completely unilateral. It didn't bring in other Latin American governments. Obama, by ending the embargo, tried to change that. Trump effectively reinstated it piece by piece. With respect to Colombia, one of the big questions really now that's coming up has been the traditional question of complicity in the paramilitary killings that had plagued the country for so long. And Uribe, the former president, is now facing serious accusations with respect to his complicity in that violence. It's important that his, at least one-time ally, the current President Duque, permit that process to go forward, not interfere. We've already, we've had kind of a history of it being extremely difficult to address official complicity in that paramilitary violence. Hopefully that ends. And similarly, hopefully the efforts to bring to justice FARC and other guerrilla leaders who themselves have been responsible for serious human rights violations, hopefully that can proceed more effectively than, frankly, it has under the peace accords that were agreed to under the prior government of President Santos.
Thanks, Ken. I should just say that we're going to say goodbye to our regional experts now, since they have to go off and do their own calls. And Santiago, I want to tell you that we are also doing a Latin America focused call at 1500 GMT, and we can give you the coordinates for that if you're interested, so contact us for that. Ken, a couple of, I think, very relevant questions from Twitter users. the first is, how have human rights challenges around the world changed in light of the COVID pandemic?
Well, the pandemic, I think, first of all, has been used by certain unsavory leaders as a pretext to entrench their power and to silence critics. We've seen that, perhaps most blatantly with what Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban did when he, for a while, became a dictator. He gave himself dictatorial powers, the right to rule by decree without parliament, ostensibly to fight the pandemic, even though we know that he has been, funneling European Union aid to build football stadiums to pay off his cronies, while Hungarian hospitals are decrepit, they're a wreck. We talked earlier about the elections tomorrow in Uganda. Museveni used the pandemic as an excuse to stop campaigning by his principal opponent, Bobi Wine, while selectively allowing his own campaign events to go forward. But I think, maybe the more profound lesson is that we've seen that the free flow of information and the ability to freely criticize the government is essential for effective public health. So in a place like Egypt, where the Sisi government is literally locking up doctors who criticize the government's response, it's no surprise that Sisi funnels money to the army, his supporters, while neglecting Egyptian hospitals where there are urgent needs. And perhaps most fundamentally, going back to China, it was Beijing's censorship of the doctors who tried to warn us of human-to-human transmission for 3 long weeks in January that enabled the virus to go global. Beijing pretended that all the cases of the virus were directly linked to the market, when that simply wasn't true. People were spreading it from one to the next. But while covering that up, literally millions of people fled Wuhan, 3,500 a day flew internationally, and we now have a pandemic. Indeed, the echoes of that cover-up resonated, during the initial response. Why was everybody so focused on washing their hands rather than wearing masks? It's because people didn't appreciate that this was a respiratory virus spread by breathing, which the Chinese kind of helped to cover up. That had disastrous consequences for doctors in Italy, in particular, during the initial outbreak there. So, the lesson here is that, governments like to portray themselves as the guardian of the people, but when they use the pandemic as an excuse to silence critics, they really are just serving themselves. And we shouldn't, let Beijing hide behind the fact that ultimately they tamed the pandemic, because, the part of China that did fight the pandemic effectively without any violation of human rights was Taiwan. Beijing violated human rights severely through the censorship, through the severe lockdown. They still don't allow independent investigation, so we don't know how many people died because of the lockdown. Citizen journalists who try to investigate are being imprisoned. There's so much we don't know. Even the World Health Organization's visit to China, the fine print is unavailable, but if it's going to be anything like the last visit, there's going to be no real opportunity to look into these critical decisions that were made early on during the pandemic.
But Ken, do you see any opportunities for human rights in the sort of pandemic landscape?
Yeah. I spoke about this earlier in my opening remarks, but I do think the pandemic has highlighted or spotlighted, I suppose, the need for sort of solidarity around things like the right to health, because the virus doesn't really care about social barriers. You can be, providing medical care only to wealthy people or only to the dominant ethnic or racial group and not others, thinking it doesn't matter, but the virus will then flourish in the part of the society that is neglected and will come back to haunt everybody else. So I think that the pandemic is an opportunity to address broad access to the right to health, to begin to target the inequality, the racial and ethnic divides that exist in so many societies, and to recognize that at a certain level, we're all in this together, and that we do have to care about even the less fortunate members. So that is, the potential positive result of the pandemic. We're not there yet, but it's an opportunity for us to seize.
So I'm going to go to a question from Inatig from the Azerbaijani Service of Radio Free Europe. I'm not going to pull the full question, but it's basically, what's HRW's position on the issue of civilians in Azerbaijan being attacked by Armenian forces? Some human rights activists in Azerbaijan voiced disappointment we're not more fully condemning these forces. Does HRW have any plan for additional investigations into these attacks?
Okay, well, let me start that, and I see Hugh is still on the call, so he may want to follow up. But you know, that question was about one side, and I'm not going to answer the question in terms of one side, because Human Rights Watch has investigated shelling of civilians, the use of cluster munitions against civilians by both sides. And we have found violations by both sides. And even though, you know, in this extremely divisive war in Nagorno-Karabakh, everyone wants you to talk only about the other side and to have, you know, human rights become a partisan tool rather than an objective, principled application of rules to both sides, you know, we're not going to play that game. And we found that there were, you know, pro-Armenian and pro-Azerbaijani abuses, the forces on the two sides, you know, including mistreatment of prisoners. And we've condemned this. We've written about both sides. But we're not going to get into the game of saying, you know, talking about one side and not the other. And even though I know that people condemn that as both sidism, it's the only objective, fair way to discuss the conflict there.
Just quickly on the specific question on attacks on Azerbaijan, I would just point to the very detailed report we published on December the 15th, documenting the findings we made about attacks on Barda and Ganja, including witness interviews and video evidence as well. We can forward that report to the person who posed the question. Regarding future work, we'll of course continuing to review where we will continue to work on documenting the abuses that took place during the 44-day conflict. Thanks so much.
Thank you both. So we're running out of time, and I'm going to wrap up with a last question from a Twitter user, which I think is extremely timely given what's going to start happening in Washington, D.C. this morning, which is, does Human Rights Watch have a view on the possible impeachment of President Trump?
Yeah. Look, there's no question that Trump is going to be impeached, probably today. You know, the trial in the Senate probably won't happen until Biden takes office and the Democrats control the Senate. But that's why I really, in my opening remarks, I spoke about the question of prosecution, because, you know, impeachment is in essence a political statement that the president went too far. That's different from saying that the president committed a crime. And so we shouldn't confuse the two. So even assuming impeachment goes forward, you know, whether or not there's ultimately a conviction, that is not a sufficient answer to what happened. And it is essential that there be a criminal investigation of the January 6th events around the Capitol, of the phone call with Georgia election officials, and, you know, in other parts of Trump's rule, you know, or before, his treatment of taxes before that, you know, his use of the presidency to advance his economic interests. I'm not able now to sort of micromanage this and say this was a crime, that's not a crime. What I do know is that it's important to have an honest, professional criminal investigation of this conduct without political interference. And that establishes the rule of law. It shows that the president is not above the law, that the president is not king, as Biden puts it. And we are highlighting that because, you know, today everybody focuses on impeachment, but that's not going to be enough. We have to assert the law, which requires an honest, objective criminal investigation, not the Obama style of looking forward, not back, which Biden was sitting at the table at when it happened. That's not an adequate response to what Trump has done. It wasn't adequate with Bush. We're seeing some of the consequences today of treating the president as above the law, and it's time for that to end.
Thank you so much, Ken. So on that note, I'm going to call this press conference to a close. If we didn't get to your question, please email us at hrwpress@hrw.org, and our press team will pass your query to the relevant person, and we'll get back to you. The press team can also share the press release that we have in multiple languages, as well as video sound bites from Ken, if that's helpful to you. We also have sound bites on video and in text from 4 human rights defenders from Venezuela, the US, Cameroon, and Russia. They're partners of ours. We asked them to talk about the importance of keeping international attention on human rights and also what Joe Biden should be doing in his term to entrench human rights in the US. So if any of those are useful to you, please email hrwpress@hrw.org. Please follow us on Twitter and Instagram. If you search us, you'll find us in numerous languages, and visit us at hrw.org. So thank you all for participating. And here's hoping that 2021 will see a more rights-respecting world for all of us.
The recording has stopped.